Hello, and welcome back to Arvos of Harvo. It's been a crazy month, I will say. July's was a lot. I planned to do a lot of reading in July, and then some stuff happened, and I got kind of sick. And over the course of that 1 week where I was sick and could not leave the house, I thought I would get so much done, and then it just didn't happen. You know, you got to be kind to yourself and realize, like, if you're not feeling well, you can't push it. And I genuinely don't know what I did that week, but I am okay with that. I can forgive myself and say, look, that's all I could do. It is also definitely the afternoon outside, but it is very dark lately. The sun goes down at like 5:30 nowadays, so I can't wait until we get daylight savings back and we can actually show the afternoon out there. Anyways, let's quickly get into the books. This month is a bit of a slump, I will say. Slightly less than usual, but we still got 5 books still out here. Wow, I hit that too hard. One thing that really satisfies me this month is that every book is the same size. So it's like this nice little stack that we have here, which is very cool. And aside from that, everything has been pretty interesting this month. I had some highs, I had some lows, but ultimately I think I had a good time. Okay, so July started really strong. Book 1 is The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. And this is just one of the greatest things I've ever read. It is so incredible. I always had a lot of respect for Le Guin because I kind of knew of her public persona, and I knew how passionate she was about science fiction and fantasy, and not just the legitimacy of those genres, but really successful writing within those genres that was just nothing like anything you could ever get, right? And she very funnily called out some very famous writers over the course of the years because of their kind of aversion to science fiction and fantasy. I feel like it's not as much of a problem nowadays, but if you go back to even the 2000s, to the 1990s, like, there was this big divide between fantasy and how you would call legitimate literature. And whenever writers would use fantasy elements or science fiction elements, but shy away from those labels, I think Le Guin was very keen to push back against that and say, actually, no, science fiction is valuable and fantasy is valuable, and this book is so valuable. Oh my goodness, it was just a great experience. It's about a planet called Winter, where it's extremely cold, but it hadn't really developed interstellar or interplanetary travel yet. And we follow Genli Ai, who is this envoy from kind of like the United Nations, but like the planet's United Nations. He comes to Winter to try and make one of the two big kingdoms of this planet join up with that federation in order to improve trade, improve life outcomes. It's a very kind of pro-UN kind of book, like everyone gathers together to share knowledge and it's all good and there's no bad stuff. But politically, like, that's where this novel is at, right? And it's very optimistic, but it is also just so beautiful in the way that it represents the kinds of individual squabbles of nations and how the two main countries of this planet, so Karhide, which is this very artistic, very not tribal, but quite like traditional culture, and they have a conflict against the other big group, which I have now forgotten their name. And they have a big conflict with the Orgota, which is another nation, but the Orgota are based on efficiency and ambition, and if left unchecked, the Orgota would become kind of the big warring dominion of this planet. And so Genli Ai arrives on this planet trying to figure out the culture, trying to figure out how people are the way they are, and to try and convince whoever is in power to connect with this intergalactic UN of sorts in order to try and prevent what is looking like a really big all-out war that is happening because of the irreconcilable differences of these two nations. And it becomes a novel about perspective, that these individual cultures see just the world around them, and so they see war with the opposing nation as just reasonable and as a logical outcome. Whereas for someone like Genli Ai, who has seen multiple planets and multiple diplomacies and really understands how big the scope of the universe is, for him to look at these two nations and their squabbles seems just very petty and on the brink of just extremely unnecessary violence. And so there's a lot to be said about this, and I haven't even got to the main conceit, which is that the planet of winter, all of the beings, I don't want to call them humans because they're not called humans. All of the individuals are androgynous, so they are both male and female, and every month they go through a phase called chemo, which is how they reproduce. And some individuals take a male role and some individuals take a female role, but individuals can take both male and female roles at some point in their life, and their whole society is developed around this idea of chemo and genderlessness and how different people spend their reproductive cycles in different ways. And this is just like an accepted fact of these characters, and it's something that very subtly dictates how people interact with each other. It kind of informs the countries themselves, and Genli Ai, as someone who has a gender, has to try and figure out how to relate himself to the nations that he's trying to talk to. It's just really fascinating. A lot of really interesting ideas going on here, but it is also just such a great, thrilling quest narrative, right? It's a political thriller about a person who is trying to seek refuge in one of two nations, both of which he is foreign to, but both of which aren't sure if he's a spy or if he's trustworthy. It is also a, I don't know if I would call it a love story, but it's a kind of platonic love story of two people developing this really incredible bond that would ask them to risk everything and anything in order to keep the other one safe and alive. And it's just so much stuff in such a really efficient, small package of text. It is by far one of the best science fiction books I've ever read. I just enjoyed it so much. I cannot stop thinking about it. It's just, there's so much in there. There's even like dynamics of history and mythology and legends of each of these two cultures. There's folk tales, and from those folk tales you kind of see how characters have the values they have. It's just so great. It's so complex, and genuinely one of those books where immediately after you read it, you want to write essays about it or read criticism about it or like know what smarter people have thought about this book, because there is just so much going on here. And I also really like this edition because it looks very cool. I like the shiny blue footsteps. I feel like that's very resonant with the emotions and the mood of this text. The only thing I don't like about this edition is that the blurb very much seems like they're ashamed of this being sci-fi. So if I was to read that, it says, 2 people, until recently strangers, find themselves on a long, torturous, and dangerous journey across the ice. One is an outcast, forced to leave his beloved homeland. The other is fleeing from a different kind of persecution. What they have in common is curiosity about others and themselves, and an almost unshakable belief that the world can be a better place. As they journey for over 800 miles across the harshest, most inhospitable landscape, they discover the true meaning of friendship and of love. That is, nothing in there mentions that this is set on another planet, right? Nothing in this mentions that it is a science fiction text. It seems like a cool literary text, which it is, and everything in that blurb is true and factual. But it is also just a great story about going to a new planet and meeting new cultures and meeting new people. It is just everything at once. It is fantastic. It's easy 5 out of 5. Recommend this to everybody. It is such a good book. Alright, book 2 is Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks. I started reading this, I think, right before I started getting sick, and low-key I blame this for the slump I have while I was sick, because I think when I was sick I just really wanted something comfortable that I could enjoy, and this book really did not give that to me. I'm going to probably drop some very hot takes in this description of this book. I know that people really love it. It won lots of awards. It's revered. It was written in the 90s, I think, or maybe the 80s, but it's respected even till now. It's very easy to get a copy of this. It's kind of seen as one of the more definitive World War I books, and I did not care for it. And so I'm probably going to be saying a few things that are controversial, and I have to disclose that I am Australian. I was born in China. I do not personally have any connection to World War I. I don't have any relatives that were anywhere near the fighting in World War I. I cannot trace my lineage or ancestry to anybody who has any connection to World War I. I just don't feel the same way that I imagine a lot of British people might feel thinking about World War I, when it's something that they can say, oh, their grandparents or their great-grandparents fought in it, or maybe even passed away in it, and they have that memory that's so powerful that makes World War I so incredibly meaningful to them in a way that it's not meaningful to me. But that being said, I feel like World War I is such a revered and respected topic that stories about it kind of get a pass. And I feel like this is one of those books that really got a pass, because its descriptions of World War One, its depictions of the fighting are actually really quite incredible. It's haunting and beautiful and doesn't shy away from the horror and the violence of it. It looks at the psychology of the soldiers, why some people fight for their belief of country and why others fight for their connections to family, and others are just nihilists and they see the death and despair of the world, and they kind of just want to see it play out. They see the war as a crystallization of that. It's complex for the period of time that is on the battlefield, but this book is really only about the battlefield for about half of it. And actually the first fifth is this love story between the protagonist, Stephen Raceford, and a young woman named Isabelle Azer, who is married to this much older French textiles mogul businessman. And it's one of those, I don't want to call it this, but I think that's exactly what it is, wish fulfillment stories, where a young man with really no distinctive features, like I don't really know anything about Stephen Raceford. I don't know much of what he looks like, what his values are, what his beliefs are, what he finds funny, like what his personality is. He's just a very like kind of blank slate person, at least at the beginning of the book. And then he finds himself in the house of Azer, who has kind of hired him to go and spy on the textiles workers and prevent them from unionizing. And then he just happens to meet Isabelle, who falls head over heels in love for him immediately, despite the fact that he doesn't really have any qualities or features. The only thing that Isabelle has to make her fall in love with Stephen is that her partner Azer is abusive and Stephen is not abusive, and so it is one of those rescue a maiden from the abusive relationship kind of stories. And I just really hated that. I thought it was completely meaningless, and it didn't really say anything about relationships or connections or like anything about that culture. It was just something to introduce us to Stephen Raceford and also get a sex scene in there, and then eventually bring him to the war. I felt like the first 100 pages could have been excised and nothing significantly would have been lost. There's this romance subplot where Stephen Raceford is then kind of searching for Isabelle and wondering if Isabelle is someone that is motivating him to fight, and there's like whole family drama things that you would expect. It's like the subplot in Pearl Harbor, right, where there's like a relationship subplot so that it's not entirely just guns blazing war the entire time. And I don't think that works very well. So that's subplot 1 that doesn't work well. Subplot 2 also doesn't work well, and that's set in the 1970s. And that is a young woman who one day suddenly decides to get really interested in World War One and find out the lineage of her parents and understand like how the war shaped her and how she's connected to soldiers in that place. And she goes to interview soldiers. She goes to try and find out all the history, read diary entries. I wonder if she's also supposed to be a kind of audience surrogate. I wasn't too sure, but she's also in a adulterous relationship. She's in love with an older man who also happens to be married, and she's trying to convince that older man to break up with his wife and then go with her. And I don't know why. I don't understand. Like, it's not adding to the narrative of the story very much. I don't feel more attached to these characters because of their adulterous relationships. Like, I just don't really know why half of the novel is devoted to these terrible, terrible relationships where nobody is happy and there's a lot of sex. And then we get to the war parts, which I did feel like were quite well done. But I feel like the horrors of war and the gruesomeness of war are just very common themes at this point. You know, I've read lots and lots of war novels, a surprising amount. If I look at the amount of novels I read, I would say like about 10% of them have to do with war or some kind of the effects of war over time. And I have really enjoyed some of those. The English Patient earlier this year was one of my favorite books, and that is about World War II, and it has a lot of superficial similarities to Birdsong. People recommend Birdsong to people who like The English Patient, but The English Patient is emotional and human and explores flawed characters and their relationships, which uses the war as a backdrop. And Birdsong is a decent war story that has a bunch of extra stuff in it that doesn't really work or fit the tone, and it robs the characters of their humanity. because before you see them in the battlefield, you see them as these weird caricatures that don't really have any significance. So that if it's not very clear to you, I feel quite negatively about this book. I feel like I had a lot of my time wasted because although there are good qualities, it really made me work for them, and not in a good way. It's one of those books. I don't think I'm going to remember this very fondly, and I have given it a 2 out of 5, and I understand why this would be incredible if you have that personal connection to World War One. I think that your experiences might align a bit more with some of these characters trying to find their histories and their backstories. It just didn't do it for me, and it felt like a lot of chaff in a book that already felt very unfocused. And that's one of the big risks with reading longer novels, is that it takes up more of your life, and you want to be more enthralled, more impressed, more immersed by a longer work. And when it doesn't fulfill that promise, and when it kind of pulls you out of the immersion constantly, you're just not having a good time. And so it took me about 2 or 3 weeks to finally finish this. And once I finished it, I am going to throw it aside and not look at it ever again. I am very sorry. Okay, book number 3. Book number 3. This is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Hugely popular, right? I don't know what's going to be more controversial. Is this book that so many people on the internet right now know and are talking about, or Birdsong, which was popular about 30 years ago, but is more about a more latent topic in society? Because The Song of Achilles is a retelling of the Achilles myth in Homer's Iliad and a little bit of the Odyssey, and it's a story that I was familiar with, having done Latin in high school, and I think everybody has a little bit of this knowledge, whether it's from movies or pop culture or something, right? Like, everybody knows Helen, and everyone knows the Trojan War, wooden horse, something, sailed 1,000 ships, apple desire, you know the basics, right? And this is a novel that really plays with the fact that people tend to know the basics, but they might not know the specifics, so the motivations of characters or the backstories or their connections to the deities. And it's not so much a book that is interested in being a factual or I guess accurate representation of how people would have believed these stories in ancient Greece. It is instead a very modern, individual-focused romance story following Patroclus, who, in the original myth, is Achilles is like special person, right? Like, Achilles treated Patroclus so closely that the death of Patroclus drove Achilles into this huge frenzy, and it turned the tide of the war. That's not a spoiler for this book, it's a spoiler for the Iliad, so I apologize if I just spoiled the Iliad for you, but also that's like 2,000 years old at this point. Anyways, so in this story we follow the perspective of Patroclus, who in the original myth, I don't actually know it that well, I will say, but I didn't feel like Patroclus was a huge part of it. It was a lot more about the individual soldiers, in particular Achilles, but my interpretation of Achilles from my engagement with Iliad-based stories is that he's always kind of a brat. He's always like really, really strong, but also kind of lazy. He's like the Goku of Greek mythology. I'm so sorry to everybody, but he's powerful and he knows it. He's important and he knows it. He has a lot of clout in the army, and he is blessed by the gods. He is part divinity. He can't be killed unless you shoot him in the ankle, and so he feels inhuman in a sense. You don't sympathize with Achilles as much as you kind of deal with the fact that he exists. And to me, when I was reading books inspired by the Iliad, I always kind of saw Achilles as that distant figure you had to account for. He is where conflicts comes from, but he's not a person that you feel attached to. And this book really changes that. This book, I think the core mission of it is to try and portray Achilles as a person that you could reasonably fall in love with, and to look at this character from Patroclus' perspective, who is Achilles' special person, to understand what kind of relationship will form if one of them is this incredible prodigy, strong, controls a lot of the dynamics of the army, and has been raised from birth to be a hero, to be a legend, and then to be Patroclus, who has his own kind of internal traumas and own regrets, and how that relationship will form, and how that is seen by the other characters. I find this book is way better if you know the myth, because then the foreshadowing really pays off. You kind of know how it's going to go, how it's going to end, and the emotional beats do hit quite a bit stronger. I know some people to get very emotional at the ending. I could see why that was the case. I think this was very well written. The pacing was really quite impeccable. It always goes forward, it always goes fast. You're always feeling something, whether it's joy or fear or sadness or regret. Like, you've always got something going for it. So it was very, very easy to read. I finished this in a day and a half. And so for all of those reasons, because I enjoyed it, I think I'm giving this a 4 out of 5. I don't know enough about the myth or about really anything to make a comment about accuracy or like carrying on the tradition of the original myth or whatever. It doesn't really matter to me. I think to the extent that this is a really, really fun story, it's a 4 out of 5. Alright, speaking of books that I don't know enough about to talk about, this is V.S. Naipaul's A Bend in the River. This, I was originally going to call my Globetrotter until I read it, and then I realized it doesn't have much to say about its setting at all. So I instead am not going to put it in the modern literature category, because V.S. Naipaul has won awards and awards and awards. He was so famous in the 70s and 80s for just being this figure of literary fiction. And A Bend in the River is one of his most famous works. It takes place in an unnamed African country, and this is why I took that out of the Globetrotter section, is because it is an unnamed African country. It's based a little bit around, I can't remember exactly which country anymore, but some of the history of Central Africa near the Congo. It follows this character named Salim, who is a trader from the northeast of Africa, and he follows advice to tell him to go to the center of Africa, start up a store, and then see how things go from there. And this book is set within those really turbulent times in Africa where leadership was changing and people were really questioning how they were going to interact with Western influence, whether they were going to invite it and invite foreign money and foreign culture and stores and values, or whether they were going to try and create some kind of unique African identity that was set apart from the Western influence. And there is a lot of conflict along those lines in this book. There's a lot of violence. There's just a strong darkness there, because this is one of those difficult questions that you need to ask in the light and legacy of colonialism, is that if you were a country that was previously subject to colonialism and you very closely knew the kinds of pain that colonizing Europeans could deal to your culture and your family and your community, when these same people then come to you and offer a better life, in their words, right? Wealth and technology and whatever they mean by modernity, do you accept it, or do you try to branch off and do something else? And is that something else ever going to be as successful or as stable as what these people who are coming into this country are offering you? It's super, super complex, or the themes in it are super, super complex, but the protagonist doesn't do any of this. He doesn't decide anything. He is just a dude, right? He comes into this town where he's not really a local, and he's just there to watch. He looks at people who buy Western stores and start franchises. He watches other young men who go to the local university end up becoming people who support revolutions. He watches all of this violence and conflict unfold around him, and he doesn't really do anything. He's just the owner of the store. And so while that gives him a position to see everybody else, he is also so risk averse and so aware of his foreignness in this location that he doesn't do anything decisive. He spends most of the book just kind of sitting back and reflecting on how other people are seeing their lives, and it makes the book feel incredibly passive, because this character is just not doing anything. And regardless of the good or the bad that happens around him, he's just this observer through which we see the world. And then 2/3 into the book, he does something, and that something is really bad. Like, it really sucks. And it's a similar problem I have with Birdsong, where there's a romance subplot, but it's kind of shoehorned in, and it feels weirdly weighted towards the man. Like, the man gets a lot out of the relationship, and the woman is like treated poorly, and it just seems underwhelming. And that, I think, kind of ruined whatever enjoyment I still could have gotten from this book, even considering that its representation of Africa, I don't know how genuine it is, I don't know how stereotypical it is. I trust this author because he's won awards and awards, but it doesn't feel like a personal story. It feels more like a grand scale, omniscient observer from an outside perspective story. Something like Heart of Darkness, right? Where Heart of Darkness is interesting to think about from a thematic perspective. You would never consider it to be a truly accurate representation of the Congo or of Africa. And in the same lens, this book raises some interesting ideas of colonialism, but it doesn't feel true to whatever an African experience may be. I kind of finished reading it and felt, I don't know if I want to take anything from this. I don't know if I've learned anything from this. And setting aside questions of accuracy, it is also just quite a difficult read for bleakness, really. By the end of it, you just kind of feel numb and empty, and I don't really know what to say about that. So overall, I would give this a 3 out of 5. I kind of recognize that it has so much clout and so much fame, but it also came from the 1970s, where there was a growing interest in Western or English literature about other countries and other cultures, but the grassroots writing and development of those stories wasn't quite there yet. We didn't still have the same sense of authenticity from those authors. And it was around this time when you got stories like Memoirs of a Geisha, or stories like what James Clavell was doing, like literary tourism in a sense, where you get someone who's done the research but is not necessarily from that culture or background, who knows it just a little bit better than you do and tries to explain it to you. I feel like the 1970s and 80s and 90s literature of this time was really marked by this, right? This interest in other cultures without genuinely having to try and understand those cultures on their terms. And going back and reading these books makes me think there's a lot of modern literature coming out right now that is genuinely from these countries and these cultures, and they are using the novel form in creative and meaningful ways that really surpass what books like this had done in the past, regardless of how many awards that the older books have won and how unknown the newer books are. I feel like the more authentic quality of these newer books are more valuable. So next month I will have to set aside my preconceived notions of award winners and whatever, and just go to a bookstore and buy some books from newer authors that I've not heard about, and try my best to actually engage with national literature on their terms, rather than just going for what seems interesting. And that is A Bend in the River. Alright, and last book for July, this is The Yield by Tara June Winch. I realized that I probably just called it June multiple times in this video, and I am not going to edit that, so whatever. This book is fantastic. This book was one of the things I have wanted most out of Australian literature. It is, to me, a book that hits everything I'm interested in. It is a generational epic. It is looking back at family and at how 100 years of history have influenced each subsequent generation of the family. It is about an older man who decides to write a dictionary of the Wiradjuri language and try to catalog everything there. It's even a book set in a place that I have personally been to. It's set around the Narrandera area, where there's a river a creek called Poisoned Waterholes Creek. And I remember one time driving around that area in regional New South Wales and thinking, that's a weird name for a landmark, right? And so I stopped by the side of the road near this creek and I Googled it. I Googled why was it called that. And no prizes for guessing. It's because horrific things happened there. A massacre happened there. And it was the Aboriginal Australians who suffered at the hands of colonists there. And that name and legacy stayed there for hundreds of years until now, right? That name is now forever marked by the violence that occurred there. And this book is exploring that dynamic because it's set in the Massacre Plains, which, yes, that is basically exactly as it sounds, where historically there was violence. And now in the modern day, how do we live with that? How do we react to that? Knowing that there were horrible, horrible things that happened in the past, but also people who the whole way through have tried to make things a little bit better. and yet the pull of trauma and of history is just so strong and so great. And so this book is really exploring how we have hope in this situation. It's so complex and yet also very easy to read because we follow this protagonist who is really easy to follow. August is very similar to the protagonist from Too Much Lip. She'd left her home area, gone to London to work for a bit, and then came back when she found out that her grandfather has passed away. And so it becomes an exercise in trying to piece back together his life. Meanwhile, we have this dictionary the grandfather had written, and it's such a fascinating idea because he defines Wiradjuri words in the context of how he would use them in his life. So if it was a certain animal, he would talk about his connection to that animal. If it was a certain emotion, he would talk about when he personally felt that emotion. And from that dictionary, you can then piece together the history of this grandfather's life and the kinds of joys and tragedies that existed there. And then there's another third narrative about a white settler and missionary who was very sympathetic towards the Aboriginal Australians and saw what colonists were doing to their communities and just how much damage they were doing. And he has this crisis of faith about whether his role is right and how can white Australians help Aboriginal Australians if there is just this latent underlying resentment in the white Australians, but also when already so much crime has been done, how do you repair that? I think just the complexity of these three narratives together is incredibly meaningful. And it's one of those, like I was saying with The Left Hand of Darkness, it's one of those books where immediately after reading, you want to know what other people who are smarter than you thought about it, and you want to see analysis, and you want to write essays of your own, and it just captures the thinking side of your mind so, so well. And it reminded me too of one of my favorite books, which is Gilead by Madeline Robinson. And that book is about looking back on a fully lived life and trying to pinpoint which individual experiences were the most beautiful and were the most valuable. It had such a joyful first-person perspective voice. And this book is quite similar. It finds so many ways to pull out moments of history and reveal them as important and beautiful, whether it's big or small. It's just a great time. I think I enjoyed reading this so, so much. This gets another 5 out of 5. Alright, so that's my 5 books of July. I didn't get to a Globetrotter and I didn't get to a classic literature this month. Next month, August, I feel like I am in a better place. I feel like I am going to read a lot more because I'm just taking the train to work every day. So I'm getting a lot more done and hopefully I will be able to get through 7 books. We'll see how we go then. Alright, thanks for joining and I will see you next time. Goodbye!